It was a bitterly cold evening in London, and the steady hum of the city had nearly subsided when the call came through to Hercule Poirot's office. It was from Lady Evelyn Hawke, a name well known in the circles of aristocracy. Her voice, though steady, betrayed a tremor of urgency. "My dear Poirot," she began, "I do not know to whom else I could turn. It is most terrible, impossible, truly. My son Robert has vanished without a trace. I fear something unspeakable has happened." Poirot sat back in his chair, his keen eyes narrowing. He had solved many baffling cases, but he could hear the strain in Lady Hawke's voice. This was no ordinary disappearance. "I will come immediately, madame," he replied, his voice calm but commanding. "Tell me, what is this matter you speak of?" By the time Poirot arrived at the Hawke estate, the night had deepened and a biting wind swept through the manicured grounds. The house was an imposing structure, its dark windows glistening in the moonlight. Lady Evelyn greeted him at the door, her face pale but composed. She led him into a drawing-room, where a group of family members and servants sat in quiet disarray, their faces tense with worry. "My son's room was locked when we went to check on him this evening," Lady Hawke explained, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "But when we entered, there was no sign of Robert. The window was closed, the door locked from the inside, and yet he is gone. Vanished." Poirot surveyed the room with interest, his eyes taking in the soft furnishings, the thick curtains, and the dark fireplace. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing that suggested a break-in. Yet the mystery of Robert's disappearance gnawed at him, a puzzle only half-formed, a question with no answer. "Perhaps there is something more to this disappearance, no?" Poirot said, turning to Lady Hawke. "What exactly led you to believe your son was taken?" Lady Evelyn's lips trembled. "It is his absence, Monsieur Poirot. I know my son. He would not leave without telling me, without giving some sort of explanation. And the circumstances, they are strange, to say the least." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "You mentioned a clue?" Lady Evelyn hesitated before reaching into a drawer of the nearby desk and pulling out a small, ornate box. It was a fine thing, gold with intricate designs, but Poirot's attention was drawn to what lay inside. A small, crumpled note, written hastily in ink. "Do you mind if I examine it?" Poirot asked, his eyes gleaming with the sharpness of a hawk's. Lady Evelyn handed it to him, and he unfolded the note carefully. The writing was hurried, as if written in distress, but the message was chillingly simple. "He is watching. The Heir must be silenced." Poirot's gaze flicked from the note to Lady Evelyn. "Your son was the heir to your fortune." "Of course," she said, her voice faltering. "Robert was to inherit everything once I pass. But why would someone threaten him? Why would he be taken?" Poirot studied the note for several moments, turning it over in his hands. There was something off about it. Too many details, yet not enough. It was as though whoever had written it wanted him to think it meant something it did not. The writing, while hurried, was too neat in its composition. A disguise, perhaps. "I believe," Poirot said softly, "that we are dealing with someone who wishes to lead us in the wrong direction. The message is meant to confuse, but it does not. It only raises more questions." He stood up, his mind already racing through the possibilities. The locked room, the missing heir, the cryptic note, all pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Yet Poirot's mind was far from stumped. Instead, he felt the thrill of The chase, the quiet excitement of a mystery that had not yet revealed all of its secrets. "Lady Hawke," he said, turning to her, "I will need to examine your son's room. I must see for myself the state of the locks, the window, and anything else that might offer a clue." The room where Robert Hawke had vanished was a masterwork of opulence, but it had also become a chamber of secrets. Poirot approached the locked door and studied the keyhole with his magnifying glass. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing unusual about the lock itself. The room smelled faintly of lavender, with no scent of anything out of place. Poirot turned his attention to the window. It was locked from the inside, the latch firm. No footprints marked the windowsill, no sign of anyone having climbed out or in. Yet Robert was gone, as though he had vanished into thin air, and then Poirot's eyes caught something peculiar. On the floor near the bed, half hidden beneath a velvet cushion, lay a single small object, a delicate silver cufflink. It was beautiful, finely crafted, but Poirot's mind immediately started turning. A cufflink, a piece of jewellery. Robert's, perhaps, or was it a message left deliberately for him to find? Poirot picked it up, turning it over between his fingers. "This, I believe, is the key to this puzzle," he murmured. "But we must discover whose it is." The pieces of the case had begun to take shape in Poirot's mind, but he could not yet say how they fit. Someone had orchestrated this disappearance, someone who had left behind clues both overt and subtle, someone who was perhaps not as clever as they thought. And with that, Hercule Poirot's investigation into the affair of the missing heir was only just beginning. Poirot's sharp eyes continued to scan the room, lingering over every detail as if each object might be hiding a clue. The cufflink in his hand was a weighty thing, its smooth surface glinting under the flickering light of the chandelier. It was beautiful, yes, but also inconspicuous enough to slip unnoticed by most. A small piece of jewellery, easily overlooked, but Poirot knew better. He tucked it into his pocket, his mind already sifting through possible explanations. Lady Evelyn stood by the door, her eyes full of worry, yet trying to mask it with a composed exterior. She was waiting for him to offer some explanation, but Poirot, as always, remained silent as he worked, his methodical attention to detail far more telling than any immediate words could be. "I will need to speak with the household staff," he said finally, breaking the silence. "The servants, the family, everyone who was in the house this evening. We must not overlook any possibility." Lady Evelyn nodded, her lips pressing together in resignation. "I will gather them for you." Poirot's eyes followed her out of the room, but his mind remained focused on the task at hand. The silence in the room was palpable, but it wasn't discomforting. To Poirot, it was simply the quiet before the storm of answers and explanations began to unfurl. He turned again to the window. The curtain, though undisturbed, seemed to whisper with a cold draught. Yet there was nothing there, no footprints, no sign of anyone leaving or entering through it. Still, the window held a certain mystery, an absence of the expected. After a few moments, Lady Evelyn returned, accompanied by several members of the household staff. The group included Robert's personal valet, a young man named Gregory, who had been with the family for several years, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, a stern woman of middle age who had worked for the Hawkes since Lady Evelyn's marriage. "Mr. Poirot," Lady Evelyn said, her voice tight, "this is Gregory, my son's valet, and Mrs. Finch, who oversees the household." Poirot turned his gaze on Gregory first, his eyes narrowing slightly as he appraised the young man. Gregory was of medium height, with unremarkable features, but his eyes darted nervously between the detective and the room, betraying an unease that was hard to ignore. Poirot could sense it almost immediately. The slight tension in his posture, the fidgeting of his hands as they clasped together behind his back. It was subtle, but it spoke volumes. "Gregory," Poirot said, his voice calm yet probing, "I would like to hear your account of this evening. You were the last to attend to Mr. Robert, yes?" Gregory swallowed hard. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. I helped Mr. Robert with his dinner, and then, well, I left him to his rest. He was fine. I left the room around 9:30, just before his usual time to retire. Everything seemed normal." His voice faltered slightly at the end, but he caught himself, straightening his back. Poirot studied him intently, taking note of the inconsistencies in his story. "You left him at 9:30, but you did not hear anything afterwards?" Poirot pressed, his gaze unwavering. Gregory hesitated. I did not hear anything unusual, no." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Not even when you came to check on him this evening? It seems to me the room was locked, yet you have no explanation for how your employer could have disappeared so suddenly. The valet shifted his weight uncomfortably. I have no explanation, monsieur, only that when we found the room empty, there was nothing, just the note." A tight silence fell upon the group as Poirot turned to Mrs. Finch, who had remained silent until now. Her stern features showed no signs of emotion, but Poirot could detect a hint of wariness in her eyes, a guardedness that piqued his curiosity. "Mrs. Finch," Poirot began, his voice gentle but piercing, "you have seen many things in your time here, yes? Perhaps you have noticed something unusual." Mrs. Finch's expression hardened, her lips curling into a thin line. "I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot," she replied stiffly, but Poirot could hear the slight tremor beneath her words. Poirot stepped closer to her, his eyes narrowing. "There is a certain tension in the air tonight. The staff, they are nervous, but perhaps you are more familiar with the house's rhythms than anyone. When was the last time you noticed Mr. Robert in any kind of distress?" Mrs. Finch's lips tightened even more, but her eyes betrayed her. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her discomfort mounting. I did not notice anything, Monsieur Poirot. But the house has always been a place of calm. We are used to order." "Of course," Poirot replied, his tone soothing. But there was no mistaking the gleam of suspicion in his eyes. Something was not quite right with Mrs. Finch's answer, and Poirot had learned long ago to trust his instincts above all else. He looked from one person to the other, his gaze growing sharp. "It is clear that someone is hiding something, and I will find out what it is. This I promise you." As the staff left the room, still whispering nervously among themselves, Poirot remained by the window, his mind racing. The events of the evening were becoming clearer now, but the answers were elusive. Gregory's discomfort, Mrs. Finch's clipped responses, it all pointed to something beneath the surface. Yet what? Poirot turned back to Lady Evelyn, who had been quietly observing the proceedings. Her face, though still troubled, had softened somewhat since their first meeting. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice tentative, "do you have any thoughts as to what might be happening?" Poirot gave her a reassuring smile. "Ah, madame, I believe the answers are just beginning to present themselves. But you must understand, there is much more to this mystery than meets the eye. The game, as they say, is afoot. The pieces were beginning to align, but Poirot knew the most critical part of the puzzle had yet to be uncovered. Someone in this house was lying, but the question remained: who and why? And what was the connection between the strange note, the vanishing heir, and the hidden tensions within the walls of Hawk Manor? He would not rest until the truth was revealed. The following morning, Poirot sat at the grand oak table in the study, a heavy silence settling over him as he awaited the next round of questioning. His mind, still sharp from last night's reflections, was already piecing together fragments of the puzzle. But the most important task now was to unravel the web of contradictions, the tangled threads of deceit that seemed to coat the air of Hawk Manor like a thick fog. Lady Evelyn had insisted that the staff be present, and so they were, gathered in the grand room under Poirot's watchful gaze. Robert's sudden disappearance had rocked the household to its core, but the detective suspected something deeper, hidden truth buried beneath layers of falsehoods. Gregory, the young valet, stood first, his posture a little more relaxed than it had been the night before. His earlier anxiety had faded, but Poirot could sense that something was still off. He hadn't been straightforward then, and Poirot doubted his story now. "Gregory," Poirot began, his voice calm, measured. "Tell me again. You helped Mr. Robert with his dinner, you said. But when you left, was he alone in the room? Or did you observe anything unusual before departing?" Gregory glanced at the others, his eyes darting nervously before returning to the detective. "He was alone, Monsieur Poirot. Nothing strange about it. He ate, then went to bed as he always does." Poirot let the silence stretch between them. There was an unmistakable unease in the young man's voice. "And the door was locked, you say? Did you check it yourself?" "Of course," Gregory replied quickly, a bit too quickly. "I always check. It's part of my duties." Poirot nodded, the piece fitting into place. "But if the door was locked from the inside, how could Mr. Robert have vanished without a trace? I believe you understand, Gregory, that we must consider every possibility, even the unthinkable." Gregory flinched, but quickly regained his composure. "I don't know, sir. I really don't." Poirot watched him for a long moment, trying to discern the truth behind his words. There was something there, hidden behind the young man's outward confusion, but Poirot would need more than just this to make his judgment. He gestured for Gregory to sit, and the young valet complied, his hands still trembling slightly. Poirot turned to Mrs. Finch, who had been standing stoically by the fireplace, her face as impassive as ever. "Mrs. Finch," Poirot addressed her next, his voice gentle, as though coaxing something out of her. "You mentioned last night that everything was calm in the house. But tell me, did you observe any tension, any disagreement between Mr. Robert and anyone else before his disappearance?" Mrs. Finch's gaze never wavered. She held herself straight, a model of discipline. "No, monsieur." "Poirot, there were no quarrels. Mr. Robert was always a quiet, agreeable young man. Nothing unusual happened." Poirot leaned forward, his piercing eyes locking with hers. "But you were in charge of the household, yes? You would have been aware if something had changed, something that disturbed the usual order." Mrs. Finch's lips pressed together, but she did not reply immediately. Instead, she looked away for a brief moment, as though searching for the right words, or perhaps considering the wrong ones. Poirot felt the hesitation. It was subtle, but it was there. "Mrs. "Finch," Poirot pressed, his voice lower now, "you must be honest with me. I have seen many things in my time, and I can tell when a person is concealing something. If there is something you are not telling me, it is in your best interest to do so now." Her eyes flickered for a brief moment, a faint trace of guilt crossing her expression. But before she could speak, there was a soft cough from the doorway. Poirot's eyes snapped to the figure standing there, Lady Evelyn. "I'm sorry, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her tone strained. "I must speak with you." Poirot gave a small nod, acknowledging her interruption, though he did not let his gaze stray from Mrs. Finch. He could feel the woman's discomfort, her unease, pressing in on him like a physical force. But for now, he turned his attention to Lady Evelyn. "Of course, madam," Poirot said, standing up and motioning toward the door. "But please, let us not delay our inquiries. There are many more questions." "That need answering." Lady Evelyn nodded, her lips tight as she stepped into the hall. Poirot followed, his mind already turning over the strange undercurrents of the conversation he had just left. He knew Mrs. Finch had more to say, but she was too guarded to reveal it easily. And Gregory... There was something about his too hasty replies, the way he sought to avoid the deeper implications of his answers. They reached the study and Lady Evelyn shut the door behind them. The air in the room felt thicker now, as though the walls were closing in with the weight of unspoken truths. "Monsieur Poirot," Lady Evelyn began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I must confess something to you." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, his senses fully alert. "What is it, madame?" "There was a letter," she said, her hands trembling as she clasped them tightly before her. "It was meant for Robert. I found it after his disappearance. It was hidden, tucked away in his desk. I didn't tell anyone about it until now." Poirot stepped closer, his attention sharpening. "A letter? What did it say, madam?" Lady Evelyn hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously. "It was not signed, but it spoke of a debt, a sum of money Robert owed to someone I did not know. I never heard him speak of it before." Poirot's mind whirred. A debt? Was this what had caused the disappearance? Or had Robert been hiding more than just a financial issue? "Did the letter mention any names?" Poirot asked, his voice almost lost beneath the rising tension in the room. Lady Evelyn's eyes flickered toward him. "No, it was just a threat, Monsieur Poirot. A warning that he would be found, and that it would be too late for him." Poirot nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to slot into place. The debt, the mystery surrounding Robert's disappearance, it all tied together in ways Lady Evelyn had not yet grasped. She had given him another clue, but it raised more questions than it answered. Who had Robert been involved with, and what had driven him to leave? The moment stretched out, but Poirot did not let the silence unsettle him. "Madame," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I believe you have given me the key to understanding this mystery, but now I must ask, are there any others who may be involved in this affair? Anyone who might be hiding something, as your son might have?" Lady Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but Poirot could see a flicker of realization dawning within her. The truth, he knew, was beginning to take shape, but it was still clouded, concealed by lies and half-truths. Lady Evelyn's eyes remained fixed on Poirot, her expression a mixture of fear and reluctant realization. she had unwittingly opened. A door to a world that until now had been hidden from view, a debt, an ominous threat. But there was more to this than just money. Poirot could feel it. The threads were tangled, each one pulling in a different direction, yet all of them seemed to converge on Robert's disappearance. "Madame," Poirot said, his voice soft but laced with authority, "this debt, it is but one piece of a much larger puzzle. I sense that there are other motives at play here. Greed, perhaps, or jealousy. Someone must have wanted something from your son, something he either could not or would not give." Lady Evelyn shook her head slowly. "I don't understand. Who would want to harm him? He was beloved by everyone. Surely you don't mean the staff?" Poirot did not answer immediately. His gaze shifted momentarily to the portrait of Robert hanging above the fireplace. The young man's face, frozen in time, seemed to stare back at him, innocent and unaware of the storm that had been quietly brewing around him. Poirot's mind, however, was already moving, assembling facts like a jigsaw puzzle, each piece falling into place with slow, deliberate precision. "Madame, you must know," he said, "that appearances can be deceiving. The staff, while loyal, have their own lives, their own pressures, and each one of them, from Gregory to Mrs. Finch, could hold a secret, a reason to act outside the bounds of what you believe to be true." Lady Evelyn recoiled, a flash of disbelief crossing her face. "You suspect them, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot leaned forward, his fingers steepled before him as he considered his words carefully. "I suspect nothing yet, madame, but I must consider every possibility. Take Mrs. Finch, for example, a woman with many years of service under her belt. It is always the most experienced who know where the fragile parts of a house lie. And Gregory, his 2 quick answers last night. What was he really trying to avoid? He allowed his words to hang in the air, the weight of his analysis pressing down on the room. Lady Evelyn's eyes darted about, her thoughts clearly racing, and Poirot knew she was beginning to see the outlines of what he had already deduced. "And the letter," Poirot continued. "That letter speaks volumes, yet it tells us very little. It is a threat, but a vague one. Who is the sender? Who would benefit from Robert's disappearance? The person behind that letter holds the key. But why would Robert not share it with you? Why keep it hidden?" Lady Evelyn opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the sleeve of her dress, her thoughts lost in a maze of confusion. Poirot stood, his boots softly clicking against the floor as he turned toward the window, allowing her a moment to collect herself. He knew this was not easy for her. The world she had known, the life she had so carefully constructed, was crumbling around her. But Poirot was not here for pity. He was here for truth. "Madame," he said finally, his voice steady, "there is something I have yet to understand. Who among the staff or the family would stand to gain from Robert's disappearance? Was there anyone with reason to want him gone, for reasons beyond what we have discussed?" Lady Evelyn's lips parted, but she said nothing. The room felt colder now, and Poirot's sharp instincts told him that the breakthrough was near. He was so close to unlocking the answer, to uncovering the motive that lay hidden beneath the layers of deceit. His mind turned back to the conversations he had had with the staff, each one laced with contradictions, each story incomplete. Gregory had been too eager to cooperate, yet the story he told had been full of holes. Mrs. Finch had been too tight-lipped, withholding information as if guarding some long-held secret. What was it about her, about them all, that didn't add up? Poirot's thoughts wandered briefly to Lady Evelyn's own words. She had said Robert was beloved by everyone, but who, then, was this mysterious creditor? If Robert had indeed hidden this debt, why would he do so? And more importantly, why had he chosen to keep it from his mother, the person closest to him? These questions hung in the air like a dense fog, but Poirot's mind was clear. He had seen this before, a tangled web of motives, fear, jealousy, and a desire for control. It was then that the door creaked open, interrupting his musings. Gregory stood there, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously between Poirot and Lady Evelyn. "Excuse me, Monsieur Poirot," Gregory stammered, his voice quivering. "There's something you should know, something I didn't tell you before, about Mrs. Finch." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he studied the young valet. This was the break he had been waiting for. "What is it, Gregory?" Poirot asked, his tone soft but insistent. "Tell me everything." Gregory swallowed hard, his hands trembling. "I overheard Mrs. Finch arguing with Robert just a few days before he disappeared. I didn't want to say anything, but she seemed angry. She was shouting about money, about Robert's father." Lady Evelyn stiffened, her eyes widening in shock. "My late husband?" Gregory nodded, his voice faltering. "Yes, madam, Mrs. Finch was furious. She said Robert was going to ruin everything. I didn't hear much else, but I thought maybe it wasn't my place to say anything, but now I think I should have." Poirot's mind clicked into overdrive. Mrs. Finch had argued with Robert, and it had been about money, a subject Poirot had suspected, but had not yet confirmed. The timing was crucial. The late Lord Hawke had left behind an estate, one that was large enough to inspire greed. Had Robert learned something about his inheritance? Had Mrs. Finch feared for her position in the household? Poirot turned back to Lady Evelyn, who now seemed even more unsettled than before. "Madame, it seems we have uncovered yet another layer to this mystery. There was a conflict between Robert and Mrs. Finch, a disagreement that involved money, and perhaps the future of the estate. This could explain her reaction to his disappearance. She had much to lose." Lady Evelyn looked away, her hand clasped tightly to her throat as though she were trying to hold back a flood of emotions. "I didn't know," she whispered. Poirot nodded, his mind still working furiously. "And then there's Gregory," he said, his eyes now moving toward the young valet. "You overheard this argument, yet you said nothing until now. Why?" Gregory shifted uncomfortably, avoiding the detective's gaze. "I didn't want to get involved. Mrs. Finch, she's a strong woman. I didn't think anyone would believe me." Poirot's sharp gaze lingered on him for a moment longer. The fear in Gregory's eyes was genuine, but Poirot also knew that fear often masked guilt. Was Gregory truly innocent in all of this? "As you see, madame," Poirot continued, turning back to Lady Evelyn, "everyone seems to have a motive here. Mrs. Finch, driven by fear of losing her position; Gregory, perhaps caught up in something larger than he could control; and you, your own fears about Robert's debts and what they might mean for your family. The web is tight, and the truth is buried deep." The room fell silent once more, the tension palpable. Poirot allowed the weight of his words to sink in, knowing that the path ahead would only get more complicated. But the pieces were beginning to fit together, and soon the maze of motives would unravel, revealing the true nature of Robert's disappearance. The investigation had taken a turn. Poirot could feel it in the air, a subtle shift that whispered of resolution, yet something within him gnawed at the back of his mind. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still an undeniable sense of imbalance. A lie seemed to pulse beneath the surface, just beyond reach, and it made his skin prickle. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. It was Gregory who, after hours of questioning, finally revealed a detail that on the surface seemed so simple and yet so profound. It was a ring. One Robert had worn often, a family heirloom, a signet with the hawk crest. Gregory had mentioned it in passing, saying it had been found in Robert's study, tossed carelessly onto a desk, as though discarded. Poirot's initial reaction had been one of curiosity. Perhaps it was a sign of struggle, or an attempt to make it seem as though Robert had simply left in haste. The authorities, however, seized upon it with vigour. The ring was now the focal point of their investigation. It was a sign of betrayal, they argued. The way it had been left behind spoke to the suddenness of Robert's departure. There was no sign of struggle in the house, nothing to suggest a forced abduction. But there, on the desk, the ring, discarded. Within hours, the case was in the hands of the authorities, and the local police were ready to declare the mystery solved. A domestic dispute gone wrong, one officer claimed. Perhaps an argument between Robert and Mrs. Finch. The ring was left behind as a marker, a sign of something left unfinished. Poirot listened in silence as the authorities surrounded Lady Evelyn with reassurances. They were convinced now, certain that the missing heir had been involved in a bitter dispute over money, a clash with the house staff, and had simply left, abandoning his inheritance in a fit of anger. The ring, they declared, was the final piece of the puzzle. It was the perfect conclusion. Neat, simple and definitive. But Poirot knew better. Mon ami, Poirot murmured to himself, his eyes narrowing as he turned away from the assembled officers. There is something wrong here. A simple piece of jewellery cannot explain this mystery. This ring, this supposed symbol of departure, it is nothing more than a misdirection. Lady Evelyn, eager for any semblance of resolution, had allowed herself a brief moment of hope when the officers spoke of an easy conclusion. But when Poirot's voice broke through the noise, she turned to him with concern. "Monsieur Poirot," she asked quietly, "are they wrong? Do you still believe there's more to this?" Poirot, ever calm, offered her a sympathetic glance. "Madame, I do not wish to disappoint you, but I must insist, this is not the end. The ring may be significant, but it is a false victory. The true criminal remains elusive, watching with patience, waiting." Lady Evelyn's brow furrowed. But how? Why? Poirot's sharp gaze flicked back to the ring, now under the care of an officer who seemed far too eager to believe in its importance. It had been placed on a velvet cushion, as if it were an object of reverence, yet Poirot saw it for what it truly was, a distraction. "There is no reason," Poirot continued, "for Robert to have abandoned his ring. Such a piece of jewellery would have been too important to him. And besides, this theory of a domestic argument over money does not fit the evidence. There is no clear motive for Robert to simply leave. If he was truly in danger, why would he leave behind something so precious?" Lady Evelyn listened intently, the scepticism on her face slowly melting into a pained realization. "Then what do you believe happened to him, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot's mind whirred as he glanced once more at the scene before him. "Everything. About this case, the misplaced ring, the eager declarations of the authorities, the contradictory stories from the staff. It all seemed too neatly arranged. It was as if someone had orchestrated a false resolution to close the matter too quickly. There was something terribly wrong with the simplicity of it all. I believe we are being misled, madame. This is not the answer. Someone has planted this false conclusion before us, so we might take the bait and stop searching. But we cannot. The ring is not what it appears. Then what is it? She whispered. Poirot allowed himself a small smile, though there was no humour in it. The ring is a symbol, madame, but not for Robert's departure. It is a symbol of something far darker. A mistake, a slip, or perhaps a calculated move, meant to mislead us down the wrong path. No one discards something of such value unless they intend for it to be found. And that is precisely what has been done here. A calculated misdirection. Lady Evelyn looked down at her hands, the weight of his words settling in. She seemed to understand, but the sense of helplessness was still there. Poirot, ever the detective, moved with deliberate precision. We must return to the beginning, madame. To the very first moment Robert's absence was discovered. We must look once more at the facts, at the people involved, and at the evidence that was not so readily embraced. The case is not closed. Far from it. And so the detective set his mind to work once more, circling the puzzle with quiet determination. There were pieces left untouched, delicate threads that the authorities had failed to pull on, clues hidden behind veils of deception. They had been fooled by the false simplicity of the ring. It had distracted them from the true motive, the true source of danger that loomed within the walls of the Hawke estate. The authorities had declared victory, but Poirot knew better. He knew that this was only the beginning. The criminal was still out there, biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The game, Poirot thought with a glint in his eye, was far from over. Poirot's mind never ceased working. In the days that followed the authorities' premature conclusion, he had remained silent, not allowing himself to be swept away by their celebrations. The ring, that symbol of finality, still weighed on his thoughts. He hadn't forgotten the subtle oddities of the case, the things that had seemed too easy, too neat to simply brush aside. And now, a quiet whisper in the back of his mind began to grow louder. There was something buried beneath the surface, something from the past. It was during a quiet evening at his office when the breakthrough came. He had asked for copies of Robert Hawke's old case files, the ones from his childhood and his brief encounters with the law. At first glance, the documents seemed mundane, minor brushes with the authorities, nothing that would indicate a deep connection to the current mystery. But Poirot, ever diligent, had noticed something peculiar. One of the files contained an old police report that had been nearly forgotten. It spoke of a previous incident, one that had taken place years ago when Robert had been just a teenager. It was a minor theft, nothing too serious, but the report had noted that Robert's family had been involved in a bitter dispute with another wealthy family, the Allens. The two families had been neighbours for decades, but this particular argument had escalated over a land deal that went sour. The document mentioned a single key detail, something that seemed insignificant at first but now stood out starkly. Robert Hawke had been seen arguing with James Allen, the only son of the Allen family, just days before the incident had occurred. Poirot studied the name carefully. James Allen had been a troublemaker in his youth, but as he'd grown older, his family's fortune had waned, and James had disappeared from the public eye for years. The Allens' name was often mentioned, in hushed tones, their reputation damaged by scandals and rumors. Yet here, in this file, was the mention of a connection between Robert and James, a link that had been forgotten in the wake of other, more pressing matters. Poirot turned the file over in his hands. It was a small detail, almost too small to matter. But in his line of work, the smallest of clues could often unlock the largest of doors. He carefully studied the old report, his eyes tracing the names, the dates, and the words of the officer who had written it. There was something about the tone of the report that suggested more than just a passing interest in the conflict between the two families. The officer had noted, almost offhandedly, that James Allen had been the last person seen leaving Robert Hawke's estate the night before the theft. This, Poirot realized, was the connection he had been missing. The missing piece. The Allens had not been on his list of suspects until now. The case had seemed entirely focused on Robert's immediate family, the staff, the close-knit circle of people who had interacted with him on a daily basis. But James Allen, he had never once crossed Poirot's mind. The name had been buried, forgotten in the chaos of the investigation. Yet now, it seemed more than relevant. And there was more. James had been involved in the theft, the argument with Robert, and then had simply vanished from public life. His disappearance had been as sudden as Robert's, and equally unexplained. Poirot's fingers tapped rhythmically against his desk. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing as the details began to connect like pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle. Robert's disappearance was not an isolated incident. It had roots in the past. And those roots were tangled in a bitter family feud that had been hidden for years. The detective knew he needed to delve deeper into the Allen family's history. There were stories, whispers of a long-standing rivalry with the Hawkes, of debts, and grudges that had festered over the years. What had once been a minor dispute had clearly evolved into something more dangerous, a tangled web of resentment, jealousy, and secrets that had led to this very moment. Poirot wasted no time. He called upon Lady Evelyn, who had been anxiously waiting for his latest findings. She arrived at his office the next morning, her face drawn with worry but still holding on to the faintest glimmer of hope. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, "have you uncovered something? Is there hope?" Poirot's gaze was steady as he met her eyes. "Madame, I believe we are looking at a much larger puzzle than we first realized. The case of your nephew's disappearance is not as it seems. It is tied to a history of conflict, one that reaches far beyond your family." Lady Evelyn frowned, confusion settling on her features. "What are you saying? What does this history have to do with Robert?" Poirot took a deep breath before continuing. "There was another man, madame, a young man, when Robert was still a boy. His name is James Allen. He is the key to understanding this case. Years ago there was an argument between the Hawkes and the Allens over a land deal, a dispute that escalated into something far more sinister. And Robert, as a teenager, was involved in it." Lady Evelyn's expression shifted. "James Allen? But he disappeared years ago. Why would he matter now?" Poirot rose from his chair, his hands clasped behind his back as he moved toward the window. "The answer lies in the connection between them. Robert and James were not strangers. They had a history, one that no one knew about, not even you. The Allens were not merely neighbours, they were rivals, enemies, with a shared past of bitterness. James Allen had disappeared after that theft, but it seems that he may not have gone far. I believe he is closer to this mystery than we first thought. Lady Evelyn's eyes widened with realization. You think he's behind Robert's disappearance? Poirot nodded slowly. Not just him, madame. I believe the entire situation has roots in that old rivalry. The Allens have been keeping secrets for years, and Robert's disappearance is merely the latest chapter in a much older story. Lady Evelyn was silent for a long moment, absorbing the weight of Poirot's words. Finally she spoke, her voice trembling. But why now? Why after all these years? Poirot turned to her, his gaze unwavering. That, madame, is the question we must now answer. The crime may have started in the past, but its true purpose is only now coming to light. He paused, allowing the tension in the room to build. Come, madam, he said, his voice now full of conviction. We must confront the Allens and uncover what they have been hiding all these years. The past has a way of resurfacing, and in this case, it will lead us to the truth. Poirot's mind raced as he sat alone in his office late into the night, the silence thick with anticipation. The connections he had uncovered, Robert Hawke, James Allen, and the family feud, were clear, but there was something else, something beneath the surface that he had yet to grasp. His instincts told him that the case was far from solved. There was a detail, a fleeting moment of human emotion, that could shift the entire investigation. But how to draw it out? The answer came to him suddenly, an unconventional approach, one that would require not just logic but an understanding of the human psyche. Poirot had studied behavior, the smallest movements, the involuntary signs that spoke louder than words. He had learned to read the slightest shift in expression, a gesture, a tone. This was how he would proceed. This was how he would unearth the truth. The following morning, Poirot convened a meeting with Lady Evelyn, along with a few of the key individuals from the investigation. Robert's family, some of the staff, and a handful of close acquaintances, all were gathered under the pretense of a formal inquiry. It was to be a routine questioning, an exercise in transparency, a way to assure the authorities that no stone would be left unturned. But Poirot had another plan in mind. He began by speaking to each person individually, but rather than simply asking them to recount their stories, he devised an exercise that would challenge them, push their emotional boundaries. The questions would seem innocent enough at first, but as the conversation progressed, they would subtly begin to test their composure. The goal was simple: to provoke a reaction, to expose an underlying lie. Lady Evelyn had agreed to the plan, understanding the need for a more profound investigation. She trusted Poirot's methods, even when they seemed unorthodox. She had no idea, however, what was about to unfold. The first to be subjected to Poirot's test was Robert's cousin, Amelia. She had been close to him growing up, and her sorrow over his disappearance had seemed genuine. Yet Poirot had always sensed that her grief held a certain distance, a coolness behind her eyes that didn't quite align with her outward display of sadness. Something about her behavior had never fully convinced him. Amelia sat in front of Poirot, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she had the demeanor of someone caught between a desire to break down in tears and the need to maintain a composed facade. Poirot regarded her quietly for a moment before speaking, his voice calm, yet probing. "Amelia, my dear, "I am sorry for your pain," he began, his tone gentle. "It must be a heavy burden to carry, not knowing where Robert is or what has happened to him." She nodded, her lips trembling slightly. "Yes, it's devastating. I can't believe this is happening. I just want to know the truth." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her, his eyes searching for the smallest shift. Of course. But tell me, Amelia, how well did you know your cousin? Truly, how well?" She blinked, taken aback by the question. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice faltering just slightly. "Did he confide in you? Did he share his thoughts, his plans, his feelings?" Poirot pressed. "It is often the case that those closest to someone, those who are most intimate, are the ones who hold the key to understanding what has happened. Do you feel that you knew him well enough to understand what was in his heart?" Amelia's face tightened for a moment, as though she had been caught off guard by the question. Her gaze flickered downward for a split second, and Poirot's sharp eye caught the tiny, almost imperceptible shift. It was a momentary hesitation, a brief falter, before she composed herself again. I'm not sure what you're asking, Monsieur Poirot," she stammered, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Poirot leaned back slightly, allowing the silence to stretch between them. He had seen it, the subtle twitch of her fingers, the brief but deliberate glance downward. It spoke volumes. There was something she was hiding, something that did not align with her words. "I see," Poirot murmured softly, then turned to Lady Evelyn, who had been watching the exchange with interest. "Perhaps, madame, we should move on to the others now." Amelia, sensing that the conversation had not gone as she had hoped, stood up quickly. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. I'll wait outside." As she left, Poirot's mind continued to churn. That crack in Amelia's composure had been faint, almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, but Poirot had seen it. Just a moment where the mask slipped. He was certain now. Amelia knew something she was not sharing. It was time to turn his attention to the others. Next, he called in the butler, Henry, a man whose loyalty to the Hawke family had been unwavering for years. Henry had been with them during Robert's childhood, and Poirot had never doubted his devotion. Yet, as with every other person in the room, Poirot knew that beneath the surface there was always more to the story. Henry's expression was composed as he entered the room, his posture straight, his eyes guarded. Poirot greeted him warmly, offering him a chair. "Ah, Henry, it is good to see you, my friend. I know this has been a difficult time for you as well," Poirot began, his voice soothing. "But we must continue our investigation. It is only through truth that we can bring Robert back safely." Henry nodded, his jaw tightening. "I will do whatever I can, Monsieur Poirot. You know that." Poirot observed him for a moment, then spoke. "Tell me, Henry, when you last saw Robert, did anything seem unusual to you? Was there a moment, perhaps, when he seemed off or troubled in a way that you had never seen before?" Henry paused, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Poirot noticed the subtle shift in his demeanour, the brief hesitation before he spoke. "No, Monsieur Poirot. Robert was always Robert. He was fine. I didn't notice anything unusual." Poirot smiled, a small, knowing smile that did not reach his eyes. "Ah, but you must have noticed something. Everyone has their moments, does one not think? Perhaps a brief flash of something, an expression, a gesture?" Henry's hand clenched slightly, his fingers curling into a fist before he relaxed them. The small action did not go unnoticed. "Now that you mention it," Henry said, his voice betraying a slight edge. "There was something. Just a moment." He seemed distant, like he was deep in thought. But that was it. Nothing more. Poirot nodded slowly, noting the inconsistency in his response. Henry's words did not match his body language. The butler had given something away, an unwitting slip, a moment of tension that suggested there was more beneath the surface. "You are certain, Henry? There was nothing else? Nothing else at all that seemed out of place?" Poirot asked, his voice low and insistent. Henry shifted in his chair, avoiding Poirot's gaze. For the briefest of moments, Poirot saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, an unease that had not been there before. The detective leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There is always something, Henry," Poirot said, his words deliberate and sharp. "Always." The butler swallowed, his throat working as though he were choking on a secret. He had cracked, and Poirot knew that, just like Amelia, Henry's deception was unraveling before his eyes. With a final, knowing look, Poirot let the moment linger before slowly rising to his feet. "Thank you, Henry," Poirot said quietly, turning away. "I believe we are getting closer to the truth." The pieces were falling into place. The cracks had appeared. The deception was beginning to crumble. But what was the truth hiding beneath it all? The investigation had begun to take on a sense of momentum that was almost tangible. Poirot had sifted through the web of deception, identifying cracks in the carefully constructed facades of those around him. Amelia's hesitation, Henry's subtle shift in posture, they were pieces of a larger puzzle, each revelation tightening the grip on the elusive truth. Poirot's instinct told him he was close, but as always, he knew to tread carefully. People would fight to protect their secrets, and he had seen enough to know that the danger was not yet past. Poirot sat at his desk, reviewing the evidence once again. The fingerprints on the old letter, the footprints near the garden, the strange transaction in the bank records, all pointed to something darker, deeper. But he couldn't yet piece it all together. His mind moved with methodical precision, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was working behind the scenes to stop him, to bury the truth before he could expose it. He was certain now that the killer was still in the house, walking among them, and he would find them, no matter the cost. Lady Evelyn entered, her footsteps soft but purposeful. She had always been an ally in this, providing support without question. But even her calm demeanor couldn't shield Poirot from the mounting pressure. Something in her eyes, something in the way she held herself, suggested that the walls were closing in, that the path ahead would not be as clear as he had hoped. "Monsieur Poirot, there's been an incident," she said, her voice strained. Something has gone missing." Poirot looked up, his expression unreadable. "What has disappeared, madame?" Lady Evelyn's gaze flickered toward the door, as though checking for eavesdroppers before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ledger, the one with Robert's financial records. It was in my office, locked in the drawer, but now it's gone." Poirot felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The ledger had been one of the most crucial pieces of evidence. It contained the financial transactions that could link several suspects together. Robert's recent dealings, the strange payments, the hidden accounts, it had all been there. Without it, he would lose a significant lead, one that might have connected everything he had uncovered thus far. "Are you certain, madame?" Poirot asked, his voice cold with barely concealed alarm. Lady Evelyn nodded, her face pale. "I've checked. I've searched every corner of my office. It's gone, Monsieur Poirot. No sign of it. No explanation." Poirot rose from his desk and walked to the window, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the grounds outside. The house, with its manicured gardens and sprawling estate, felt like a labyrinth now. He could sense the trap tightening around him, as if the walls themselves were conspiring against him. Someone didn't just want to keep the truth hidden. They wanted to make it impossible to find. "It appears," Poirot said slowly, his mind already calculating the implications, "that we are not dealing with a simple case of murder, but a far more intricate game. Someone has gone to great lengths to ensure that certain truths remain buried, and it is not by chance that this ledger has disappeared now." Lady Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she clutched the armrest of the chair. Who would do such a thing? Why would they risk so much? Poirot turned back to face her, his eyes steely with determination. "That is precisely what we must determine, madam. We must look at everything through a new lens. The person who took the ledger is not just trying to hide one small piece of information. They are trying to prevent us from seeing the bigger picture. The game has changed." With that, Poirot strode toward the door, his thoughts racing. Every suspect in the house now came under scrutiny. But there was one person in particular whose actions had stood out to him, Amelia. She had been far too eager to distance herself from Robert's affairs, her story about their relationship too rehearsed, too carefully crafted. It was her hesitation during the questioning that had caught Poirot's attention, and now, with this new development, he couldn't ignore the possibility that she might be the one responsible for the stolen ledger. The detective's mind was a whirlwind of connections, scenarios, and probabilities. Amelia's relationship with Robert had always been a murky one. He couldn't deny that there were reasons, powerful ones, that could have driven her to act. She was connected to everything. The family, the money, the estate. She had the motive, and now perhaps the means. Poirot was interrupted by a knock on the door, and before he could respond, the door opened, revealing Henry, the butler. His face was as impassive as ever, but Poirot could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Is everything in order, Monsieur Poirot?" Henry asked, his voice steady, but there was something else beneath the surface, a subtle wariness, a guardedness. Poirot studied him carefully, but before he could respond, a cold chill swept through the room. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled again as he glanced toward the desk. The faintest disturbance caught his attention. The edge of a piece of paper, partially hidden beneath a stack of folders, seemed to shift ever so slightly. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He moved swiftly, his fingers brushing over the documents on the desk, until he found what he was looking for: an envelope. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, but as he unfolded it, the words on the page were an ominous warning. "Stop!" The handwriting was unmistakable. It was the same handwriting he had seen in the margins of the ledger. Someone had tried to leave a message, but more importantly, they had clearly been watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. The stakes had risen dramatically. Whoever had taken the ledger was not only trying to obscure the truth, but they were also aware of his every move, anticipating his actions with alarming precision. Poirot's eyes snapped up to Henry, who had not moved an inch since entering the room. The butler's face had gone pale, his expression now a mixture of confusion and fear. The sudden realization hit Poirot with the force of a lightning bolt. Henry was hiding something far more dangerous than he had initially suspected. "Henry," Poirot said, his voice low and deliberate, "it seems that we have reached an impasse. But I assure you the truth will be revealed, no matter the cost." The butler swallowed hard but did not speak. Poirot could see the walls closing in, and as he watched Henry carefully, he knew that the game was far from over. Whoever had taken the ledger was watching him, anticipating his every move. They were drawing him closer, deeper into their trap. But Poirot was not so easily cornered. The truth was out there, waiting to be unearthed. And Poirot would stop at nothing to expose it, no matter the cost. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but Poirot had always thrived in the most perilous of circumstances. Now, more than ever, he knew one thing for certain. Someone was going to make a mistake. And when they did, Poirot would be there, ready to catch them in the act. Poirot's mind raced as he stood in the dimly lit office, the envelope still in, his hands, the single word "stop," searing into his thoughts. Henry had been too composed, too quiet. Poirot's instincts screamed at him that the butler was involved, but the puzzle was far from complete. The discovery of the note hidden beneath the clutter signaled a shift, a clear sign that the case was evolving into something more perilous, more dangerous. Yet, before he could further analyze his next step, a sound, sharp and unmistakable, shattered the tense air. A scream. It pierced the quiet of the estate like a knife echoing from the direction of the hallway. Without thinking, Poirot dashed out of the office, his mind immediately calculating the possibilities. Who could be in danger? What could have triggered such a scream? As he rounded the corner, he saw it. Amelia, her face white with terror, standing in the doorway of the drawing room. Her hand trembled as she pointed into the room behind her, where a figure lay crumpled on the floor. Poirot didn't hesitate. He crossed the threshold of the room in 2 swift steps, his mind already shifting into full investigative mode. There, in the middle of the ornate rug, was Robert's body. But something was different this time. Robert's once unmistakably controlled features were now contorted in a grimace of terror, his eyes wide and staring at something unseen. His body, rigid and lifeless, spoke volumes. But the most significant clue was the bloody knife that lay just inches from his outstretched hand. It wasn't just another murder. It was a deliberate message. The room was heavy with the scent of iron, and the silence was suffocating. Poirot stood still for a moment, observing the scene with his trained eyes. Amelia's frantic breaths filled the silence, and as she looked at Robert's body, her hands clutched her throat in distress. But Poirot could sense something else in her demeanor, something other than the shock of discovery. The reaction was almost too perfect, too practiced. She had been expecting this. "Mon Dieu," Amelia whispered, barely able to catch her breath. "Not again, not Robert." Poirot's gaze swept over the scene. The knife was still fresh with blood, and there was no sign of forced entry. The windows were locked, the door closed. There had been no struggle, no sign of an intruder. The crime had been staged, and Poirot could feel the weight of the deception hanging in the air. But the most disconcerting element was the fact that the second murder mirrored the first in so many ways. Each killing was planned with meticulous care, down to the smallest detail. Poirot turned to Amelia, his voice calm but firm. "Mademoiselle, you must leave the room. I need to investigate." Amelia hesitated for a split second, then nodded, slowly backing away from the body. Poirot didn't miss the subtle glance she cast toward the desk, as if something there held a deeper meaning. He allowed her to retreat without protest, his focus now entirely on the scene before him. A cold sweat ran down Poirot's neck as he crouched beside Robert's body. The position, the look of terror in his eyes, it all pointed to something far more sinister than simple revenge. This wasn't an impulsive act, it was calculated, methodical. The killer wanted to send a message, to make sure Poirot understood that they were still in control, that they were still one step ahead. As he examined the knife, Poirot's gaze flicked to the side, catching a glimpse of something that sent a shiver down his spine, a small folded piece of paper wedged beneath Robert's body. He carefully pulled it free, unfolding it with deliberate precision. His eyes skimmed over the text, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw the words scrawled hastily on the page. "You were warned. Now it's too late." A chill swept over him. This was no longer just a murder case. It was a challenge, an overt declaration of war against him. The killer was taunting him, and it was clear that the situation was spiraling out of control. The stakes had been raised. It wasn't enough to simply solve the crime. Now, Poirot had to prevent another. Without a word, Poirot stood, his thoughts spinning. There was no time to waste. He had to act quickly, but with precision. This was no ordinary killer, and every move had to be calculated. He glanced back at the hallway where Amelia had retreated, still in shock. He couldn't trust anyone, not with this new development. Everyone was now a suspect, and the killer had just made their intentions clear. They weren't finished yet. Poirot's mind raced through the connections he had already made. Robert's financial dealings, the missing ledger, the strange warning, left at his desk. All these pieces were beginning to fit together in a way that was both terrifying and enlightening. But the question remained, who had the most to gain from these murders, and why now? The only thing that was certain was that someone had anticipated this moment. Someone knew exactly how Poirot would react, and they had been planning for this moment. He was being pushed into a corner, but the detective knew that it was only a matter of time before the true criminal made a mistake. Poirot turned sharply to the door, ready to pursue the next lead. The rest of the house was still silent, but he knew that the killer was out there, waiting for their next move. The question now was not just how to solve the case, but how to prevent the next crime from taking place. Time was running out, and Poirot would need every ounce of his intellect to outsmart a mind that was determined to stay one step ahead. As he moved down the hallway, his footsteps steady but urgent, he could feel the weight of the danger closing in around him. Every suspect now had a motive, and Poirot was no longer just investigating murders. He was hunting a killer who was playing a far more dangerous game, and in this game, the rules were still being written. Poirot's mind was an eye-dying whirlwind of theories and possibilities, each more perplexing than the last. The second murder had shifted the course of the investigation dramatically, but in its wake, it left a trail of subtle hints, inconspicuous details that demanded his attention. He paused in the hallway, the sharp scent of blood still lingering in the air, and allowed himself a brief moment to think. His every instinct was telling him that something crucial had been overlooked, something that, if correctly interpreted, would reveal the truth behind the murder spree. He replayed the events in his mind. The pattern was becoming clearer with each passing second. The two murders were not isolated incidents. They were connected, intricately woven together by a common thread. Each crime seemed carefully executed, but it was the minor inconsistencies in each case that began to form a narrative. Poirot's eyes narrowed as his thoughts sharpened. Amelia had mentioned something during her panic in the drawing room, something that at first seemed inconsequential but now stood out like a flashing neon sign. Not again. The phrase had been repeated with such intensity that Poirot wondered if it was more than just a reflection of shock. Had Amelia seen something that tied her to both victims, or had she perhaps been aware of something much darker? It was the sort of comment one made when a hidden connection, something from the past, suddenly resurfaces with terrifying force. Poirot turned to leave the scene, retracing his steps down the hallway, his mind flicking over the recent developments. He couldn't ignore the growing sense that a deeper story was unfolding. He stopped in front of the study, the door ajar, and stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the desk. The clutter of papers and disorganized files greeted him like an old friend, but it was the faint impression on the desk, a set of fingerprints, that caught his attention. Upon closer inspection, Poirot recognized the distinct pattern they formed, not random smudges. The imprints weren't from a hasty search. They were deliberate, arranged in a way that suggested someone had been rifling through the desk with a purpose. But what had they been searching for? The question hung in the air like a thick fog, and Poirot's eyes flicked to the ledger that lay half open on the desk. It had been placed there so casually, as though it had been left forgotten by its owner, but Poirot's trained eyes saw through the illusion. This was no accident. He reached for the ledger, flipping it open slowly, allowing his fingers to linger on the pages. As his eyes scanned the entries, he paused, a small gasp escaping his lips. The names. They were familiar. It was a list of people, none of whom had raised any immediate suspicions before. But one name stood out: Roberts. The ledger contained financial records, but there were also cryptic annotations next to certain entries. The numbers didn't add up, and a few names had been circled with a red pen. Poirot's mind raced as the implications began to take shape. This wasn't just about greed or revenge. It was something more personal. He stood there for a moment, considering the possibilities, before a sudden realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. The pattern he had been searching for wasn't just in the murders. It was in the way everyone had been acting, the way the suspects moved, interacted, and spoke. He had been looking at the wrong clues. The answers had been in plain sight, disguised as harmless habits and casual remarks. It was the details that connected the victims. Robert had been a key figure in a business deal that had gone sour, and the events surrounding his death had been a carefully calculated move. Poirot's suspicions about Henry, the butler, now seemed all the more plausible. The man had been in the right place at the right time, seemingly without cause. His cold demeanor had only strengthened Poirot's belief that he was somehow involved, but there was more, much more. The financial ties, the strained relationships between family members, and above all, the offhand comments, everything pointed to a single conclusion. Poirot's gaze shifted back to the ledger, his mind still turning over the details. The red pen, markings on the pages weren't just numbers and names. They were part of a larger puzzle, one that had been pieced together over time. The murderer had been operating under the assumption that the clues would be dismissed, that the pattern would be overlooked. But Poirot had seen it, had uncovered the first layer of the conspiracy. He closed the ledger carefully, his fingers brushing over the smooth surface of the pages. His thoughts moved swiftly, each one connecting the dots with increasing clarity. The killer wasn't just trying to hide their tracks. They were leading him on, forcing him to unravel the tangled web that had been created. His mind began to piece together the next step in the investigation. The ledger was just the beginning. There were other things, other seemingly insignificant details that would now take on new meaning. Amelia's slip of the tongue, Henry's odd behavior, the way certain pieces of evidence had been carelessly discarded. They all pointed in one direction. It was time to confront the suspects, to test his theories, to see who would crack under the pressure. The pattern had emerged, but it was only the beginning of the endgame. Poirot's steps grew more purposeful as he moved from room to room, methodically searching for the final pieces of the puzzle. The answers were within his grasp. Now it was a matter of whether he could outwit the killer, whose game was only just beginning. The chase was on, and Poirot had every intention of winning it. Poirot stood in the dimly lit parlour, the evening, air cool against his skin as he reflected on the tangled mess of lies, half-truths, and coincidences that had brought him here. It was as if every clue had been a piece of a puzzle that refused to come together, each one pointing to a different possibility, leading him down paths he had believed to be true, until now. The truth was no longer simply an equation of facts and figures, nor was it a question of personal vendettas or financial gain. What lay beneath the surface was something more insidious, something that went beyond the mere act of murder. He thought of the ledger he had found, the hidden connections that had led him from one suspect to the next. Robert, Henry, Amelia. They all had their secrets, but none of them were the true motivators. No, there was something darker at play, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far longer than anyone had suspected. As Poirot continued his investigation, a subtle shift had taken place in his understanding of the case. He began to see patterns in the behavior of the people around him, the way they reacted to certain questions or movements in the investigation. It was as if they were all playing a part, but not in the way they thought. Poirot could feel the invisible threads of manipulation being pulled from behind the scenes, each person being carefully positioned for a very specific endgame. And then, there was the subtle shift in Amelia's behavior. She had been nervous, flustered, trying to cover her tracks, but when Poirot had mentioned a certain name, one that had not appeared in any of the public records, he had seen her reaction. It had been so subtle, so quick, that no one else would have noticed. But Poirot had seen it. Amelia wasn't just involved in the case. She was at the center of it. Her attempt to distance herself from Robert had been a carefully constructed illusion, a means of deflecting suspicion. The more he pieced together, the more the darkness of the situation became clear. This wasn't about simple revenge, not about money, or even justice. No, there was something far more personal driving the murders, a history that spanned years, maybe even decades. It was a history tied to family secrets, betrayal, and a twisted desire to restore a sense of control that had been lost long ago. Poirot recalled the conversation he'd had with Henry, the butler. He had been dismissive, evasive, and yet Poirot now saw it had been all part of the game. Henry was far more than a mere servant in the household. He had been a confidant, a key player in the web of manipulation, serving as both witness and protector to someone who had long been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The clues were starting to line up like a neatly arranged set of dominoes. But one last piece remained to be put into place. The one thing that had remained elusive until now, the villain's true motive. Poirot sat in front of the fireplace, his mind racing as he reviewed everything he had uncovered. Amelia, Henry, Robert, they all had their reasons for being involved, but none of them explained the depths of the actions that had been taken. And then it hit him. Just as the flame in the hearth flickered and danced, so too did the realization burn bright in his mind. The true motive was not one of external gain, but of a deep psychological need that had twisted its way into the hearts of those involved. He closed his eyes, visualizing the connection. Amelia, it seemed, had been obsessed not with power or revenge, but with a need to rewrite history. Her family's fall from grace, the loss of wealth and status, had left her hungry to reclaim a sense of significance, but she hadn't wanted to simply get her inheritance back. She had wanted to erase the years of shame, to recreate her family's image, and she was willing to go to any length to do so. And there, in the shadows of her manipulation, was Henry, her partner in crime. They had been working together all along, not out of some grand plan for revenge, but for the satisfaction of watching a carefully crafted empire burn. Amelia's need to destroy her family's tarnished legacy and build something from the ashes had led her to make the darkest choices, leading to Robert's murder, Henry's role in the cover-ups, and the series of carefully orchestrated events that had placed them all in a position where the truth might never come to light. Poirot could now see it clearly. Amelia had been driven by something deeper than greed or rage. It was a thirst to make her family's name matter again, a desperate desire to erase the wounds of the past by inflicting her own wounds on others. But the most chilling part of all was that she had been so convinced of her righteousness, of her need to cleanse her family's reputation, that she had justified each and every act of violence, each step taken to make sure her work would succeed. To her, it was not murder. It was liberation. The shock of the realization was almost too much to bear. Amelia had known she was being watched, but her carefully honed instincts had led her to believe she could outsmart Poirot, just as she had outsmarted everyone else for years. But she had underestimated him. Poirot stood up, the weight of the discovery settling heavily on his shoulders. The case was coming to a head, but the danger was far from over. Amelia's mind was not just a labyrinth of twisted thoughts. It was a ticking time bomb, and unless Poirot acted swiftly, there was no telling how far she would go to ensure her vision of control remained intact. The last pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, but Poirot's instincts told him there was still one more act to be played. One final confrontation that would reveal just how deep the darkness had truly taken root. As he made his way toward the drawing room, his pulse quickened. The game was not over, not yet. The evening sky outside the mansion had darkened into an ink-black cloak, the moon casting faint shadows on the marble floors of the drawing room. Poirot stood at the window, his hands folded behind his back, his sharp eyes scanning the scene outside. He had orchestrated it perfectly. The final confrontation was set, the players all positioned in their places. It was only a matter of time before Amelia made her move. The air felt heavy with anticipation, a thick silence pressing in from all sides. Poirot had left no room for escape, no shadow in which she could hide. He had lured her here with a single, deliberate act, a carefully staged piece of misinformation, a false lead that would draw her into the trap. The pieces of the puzzle had all come together, and now there was nothing left but the moment of reckoning. He had thought long and hard about the most effective way to expose her, to break through the walls she had built around herself, the perfect facade of control she had cultivated for so long. She had been so confident, so sure that she could manipulate the situation to her advantage. But Poirot had seen through it all. He had known from the start that she wasn't the pawn she pretended to be. She was the architect of her own twisted empire, and it was time for that empire to crumble. The door creaked open behind him, and he didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Amelia's presence filled the room, her footsteps slow and deliberate, each one measured, as if she could control the very air between them. "Mon cher detective," she said, her voice smooth but with an edge of tension. "I do hope you are not planning something too theatrical." Poirot turned, his gaze unwavering, calm, the faintest flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "Ah, Mademoiselle Amelia, I believe you know very well what is about to unfold. You have been playing a game for far too long, but it is a game that is now at its end." She smiled, but it was tight, brittle. "You think you have it all figured out, don't you? You've been following me, watching me, making your little deductions. How quaint." Poirot stepped closer, his voice soft, yet filled with the undeniable weight of truth. "I am not in the habit of chasing shadows, mademoiselle. Nor am I one to make assumptions without evidence. I know you. I know the lengths to which you have gone to conceal your motives, to manipulate those around you. But alas, you have underestimated me." Her smile faltered just for a moment, but it was enough. Poirot saw it, saw the crack in her mask, the flicker of doubt. She had expected him to play by her rules, to be just another pawn in her elaborate chess game. But he had turned the table, and now the game was hers to lose. "I know your secret," Poirot continued, his voice low but unyielding. "The obsession with your family's legacy, the lengths you were willing to go to in order to rewrite history, to bury the past, to cleanse your name, to erase the stains you could not bear." Amelia's breath caught in her throat, her face draining of colour. For the briefest moment, the proud, confident woman in front of him appeared to shrink, the weight of her own guilt pressing down on her like an anchor. "I know about your plan," Poirot went on, his words like a knife cutting through her defences. "The murders, the cover-ups, the manipulation of those closest to you, Robert, Henry, even your own family. They were nothing but pieces on your board, sacrificed in the name of your twisted sense of justice, your need to control the narrative, to reshape the world around you according to your own design." Amelia's eyes flashed with fury, but Poirot could see the tremor in her hands, the tightening of her jaw. The truth, it seemed, was unbearable, and yet it was the one thing she could not escape. "You are wrong," she spat, her voice shaking. "You think you understand? You think you know what it's like to be driven by something greater than yourself? To be trapped in a legacy that is nothing but a burden, a constant reminder of failure." She took a step toward him, her eyes wild, almost manic. "You have no idea what it's like to live in the shadow of something you can never escape. To see your name, your family's name, dragged through the mud. To watch everything you ever cared about slip through your fingers while others take everything from you. I had no choice but to do what I did. Poirot stood his ground, his expression unchanging, calm as ever. That is where you are wrong, mademoiselle. You did have a choice. You chose to kill, to destroy, to bury the truth under a mountain of lies. You chose to sacrifice others, to manipulate their lives for your own gain. You may call it justice, but it was nothing more than the pursuit of power. A power that you were never meant to wield. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Amelia stood frozen, her breath ragged, her eyes no longer defiant but desperate, as if she were clinging to the last shred of a dying dream. I did what I had to do, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I did it for us, for me, for all of us. Poirot shook his head, the disappointment evident in his gaze. No, mademoiselle, you did it for yourself, and now you will face the consequences of your actions. There is no escape from this, not anymore. As the finality of the words settled into the air between them, Amelia seemed to collapse inwardly, the last of her defenses crumbling. She reached into her coat, her fingers trembling, as if to pull something, anything, from the pocket. But Poirot was quicker, his hand closing around hers before she could make her move. I would advise against that, he said softly, his eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. It is over, and just like that, the game was finished. Amelia's rebellion, her need for control, her desire to rewrite history, all of it had come to an end. With a resigned sigh, she let the weapon fall from her hand, the realization settling on her like the weight of the past she could never escape. Poirot, composed and resolute, allowed the moment to stretch just a little longer before he signaled for the authorities to come. The trap had been set, the truth had been revealed, and Amelia, at last, was left to face her own shattered empire. The mansion was eerily quiet now, the weight of the truth settling in like the stillness after a storm. The authorities had arrived, and Amelia was being led away in handcuffs, her gaze never leaving Poirot's face. There was a finality in the air, as though the case had been solved, the villain caught, and the puzzle completed. But something lingered in the back of the detective's mind, an unease, a nagging feeling that wouldn't go away. Poirot watched Amelia disappear into the back of the police car, his fingers lightly tapping against the side of his chin as he pondered the last few moments. He had known, of course, that she was the culprit, had seen through the layers of deception, but something about this resolution felt too clean, too easy. As the last of the officers began to clear out, Poirot lingered in the doorway, his mind racing through the twists and turns of the case once more. The murders, the lies, the manipulation, it all made sense, yes. But there was a single troubling detail he couldn't shake. Amelia had confessed. She had fallen into the trap he had so carefully set. And yet, something in her eyes had told him there was more to this story, something far more complicated than just a woman consumed by power and revenge. Poirot turned away from the door, his mind sharpening. He had been so focused on the woman before him, on the immediate threat she posed, that he had overlooked one crucial fact. Amelia had never been the true mastermind. She was simply a pawn, manipulated just as much as the others. His gaze flicked to the desk where his case notes were scattered in neat piles, each one chronicling the twists of the investigation. He reached for the page detailing the discovery of the first murder, his fingers tracing the words, reading between the lines. It was there, buried beneath all the noise, an overlooked detail, something that had slipped his notice in the frenzy of the chase. A name that had never quite added up. Poirot's pulse quickened as he picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't thought to contact before. It rang twice, then a sharp, familiar voice answered. Poirot. The voice was calm, cool, and collected, too calm for this moment. "Is something wrong?" "It would seem so, my dear friend," Poirot replied, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "I believe the game is far from over. We have been misled and the true villain is still in play." There was a pause on the other end of the line and then a quiet laugh. "You've figured it out, haven't you? You always do." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his hand gripping the phone tightly. "I should have known. You've been orchestrating this from the very beginning. But why? Why hide behind Amelia? What is it that you want?" The voice on the other end chuckled softly, the sound cold and detached. "You're too late, Poirot. It was never about Amelia, never about the others. You think you've solved the puzzle, but you've missed the most important piece. The game has only just begun." Poirot's mind raced, his thoughts aligning with the sudden realization that struck him like a bolt of lightning. The seemingly inconsequential details, small things he had dismissed, little inconsistencies that didn't fit, had all been leading him to this moment. The murders, the thefts, the manipulations. It was all part of a much larger plan, one that had been set in motion long before Amelia ever entered the picture. And now the true mastermind had revealed themselves, just as Poirot had suspected they would. But who was it? And why had they waited until now to show their hand? Poirot's thoughts flitted to the people closest to him, the ones who had been with him throughout the case. He'd trusted them, relied on them. But trust, it seemed, had been his greatest weakness. "You've played your part well," Poirot said, his voice cold now, the faintest hint of accusation slipping through. "But I wonder, who are you really? Who do you work for? What is your end game?" The voice on the other end let out a long, slow breath, as though savoring the moment. "I work for no one but myself, Poirot. And as for the end game, well, let's just say that we all have our motivations. Some are driven by power, others by money. Me? I'm driven by something far more interesting, the desire to watch the world burn." With that, the line went dead. Poirot stood still for a long moment, his mind spinning. The revelation had shaken him to his core, yet it was exactly what he had feared. The truth was never as simple as it seemed. Amelia had been nothing but a pawn, a distraction. The true villain had been lurking in the shadows, manipulating everyone, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. His thoughts returned to the phone call. He had recognized the voice. A name that had been on the periphery of his investigation, a name that had never quite made sense but had been there all along. A name he had dismissed because it seemed too far-fetched, too ridiculous to be connected to the case. But now, the pieces were falling into place. The true mastermind was someone he had trusted, someone who had been working from within. Poirot's mind raced through the events once more, the overlooked signs, the subtle manipulations. How had he missed it? How had he let the real villain slip through his fingers? His gaze shifted to the door as footsteps echoed down the hallway. The faintest sound of a door opening, the faintest click of a lock. Poirot knew that time was running out, that the villain was already one step ahead of him, but this time he would not make the same mistake. The last twist had come, and it was one he would not ignore. With the pieces of the puzzle now fully in his mind, Poirot stepped out of the room, ready to face the truth he had been blind to. The final confrontation awaited, and this time, the mastermind would not escape. Poirot's every step echoed in the dimly lit hallway, a deliberate rhythm that matched the urgency of his thoughts. The revelation still gnawed at him, but it was clear now. The mastermind had been hiding in plain sight, manipulating everyone with a brilliance he couldn't deny. The pieces had finally fallen into place. Yet as he approached the door to the study, a bitter truth settled within him. The villain had slipped away once again. The door creaked open, revealing the room bathed in soft amber light. The familiar clutter of papers, photographs, and notes filled the desk, but it wasn't the case files that caught Poirot's attention. It was the lone figure standing by the window, gazing out at the sprawling garden below. The unmistakable silhouette of a man who had been in his presence more times than he cared to count. Jenkins, Poirot's voice was low but firm. "I should have known it was you all along." Jenkins didn't turn, didn't even flinch, at the sound of his name. Instead, he continued to stare out the window, a cold smile playing on his lips. "You always were good at seeing what others couldn't. But this time, Poirot, you missed the most crucial piece." The detective's gaze flicked to the floor, where a half-hidden object lay, its presence as subtle as the rest of the clues Jenkins had planted. The small key dropped carelessly as if it didn't matter, an object that had been found far earlier in the investigation, but whose significance had been overlooked by every investigator who followed the trail. A clue, buried in the most mundane of places. Poirot's mind whirred as he recalled the key's appearance, its placement under a chair, almost lost in the dust, far from the scene of the crime, yet strangely connected to the events of the past week. It wasn't just a key. It was the key, the one that opened the hidden door to Jenkins' secret machinations. It had never been about the murder itself, or the money, or even revenge. No, Jenkins' true aim was far more elaborate, far more insidious. "You led me on a chase," Poirot said, his voice sharp, hiding behind lies, behind others. "Amelia was your distraction. The theft, the murders, they were all to keep me from seeing what was right in front of me." Finally, Jenkins turned, his face now illuminated by the light from the window. There was no remorse, no hint of regret, only the cold, calculating gaze of a man who had outsmarted the system at every turn. "You see, Poirot, the thing about secrets is that they're only secrets as long as you let them be. And I let you chase after the wrong ones while I controlled the narrative." Jenkins took a step closer, his shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. "You think you're clever, don't you? Solving puzzles that nobody else can solve, seeing things others miss. But there's one thing you never could grasp. Sometimes the answer is right in front of you. Sometimes it's so obvious it blinds you." Poirot's mind raced as Jenkins spoke. He could feel the familiar tug of frustration, the irritation that came with knowing the truth, but not the full story. "You never intended for me to catch you. You wanted me to come close, to piece together enough of the truth to get me here. This moment, this confrontation." "Exactly," Jenkins said, his smile widening. "I wanted you to figure it out, Poirot." But not until it was too late. The plan was never about killing Amelia or anyone else. It was always about creating a distraction, weaving a web of lies to get you to chase shadows. I wanted to see how far you'd go, how close you'd get to the real motive. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And the motive? What could possibly justify this? Jenkins' laughter echoed in the room, a low, almost mocking sound. It's not about money, Poirot. It's not about revenge either. It's about control, power. I've been watching you, studying you. You're brilliant, but you've always been too focused on the details, too caught up in your obsession with order. I wanted to show you that sometimes chaos is the most effective tool. Poirot's heart quickened as Jenkins continued. His words were a confession, but they were also a challenge. The game had never been about right and wrong. It was about proving who was truly in control, who could outwit the other. Poirot had thought he had won, thought the truth was his, but in reality Jenkins had always held the upper hand. "But why?" Poirot began, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "Why go to such lengths, destroy so much? For what? A game?" Jenkins' smile softened, but there was no warmth in it. "Sometimes, Poirot, people like us, people who live in the shadows, who work behind the scenes, are the only ones who truly understand the game. We're the ones who manipulate the pieces. You see it as a mystery to solve, a puzzle to complete. But to me it was always about showing that I could do what you do. Only better." Poirot stood still for a moment, considering the weight of Jenkins' words. His mind was sharp, as always, but the emotional toll of the investigation was starting to show. He had been so sure of his victory, of the justice that would follow, but now it seemed the final piece of the puzzle was still missing. "What happens now?" Poirot asked, his voice quieter now, a knowing edge creeping into his tone. "Will you run, hide like a coward, or will you face the consequences of your actions?" Jenkins shrugged, a nonchalant gesture that only added to the tension in the room. "You think I'm afraid of consequences? No. What's the point? I've already won, Poirot." The truth was never the point. The only thing that matters is that I did it and you walked right into my trap. You've been playing by my rules from the start. And with those words, Jenkins turned and walked toward the door, his figure silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. Poirot stood frozen, the weight of the realization crashing down on him. Jenkins had won. The case had unraveled in a way he hadn't expected, but the pieces were there even now, the final pieces of a twisted game that had no clear end. The sound of footsteps grew distant, and Poirot knew with a sickening certainty that justice would not be served today. Not this time. The villain had escaped, slipping through his fingers like sand. There was no closure here, no neat ending to wrap up the case. Only the bitter taste of unfinished business, a puzzle that would never be fully solved. And for the first time in his career, Poirot wasn't sure whether justice would ever be truly served. The rain had started to fall in sheets as Poirot made his way down the stone steps of the mansion, his umbrella barely keeping up with the relentless downpour. His mind was still tangled in the web of events that had unfolded, each thread a part of a mystery that refused to let go. He had walked away from the confrontation, but the truth, what little of it he had, left him uneasy. The car door slammed, behind him with a soft thud, and Poirot leaned back in the seat, his eyes drifting out the window. The rain blurred the city streets, the lights of London nothing more than hazy reflections in the puddles that collected on the pavement. His thoughts churned, sifting through the details once more, searching for something he might have missed, a final piece that still eluded him. He had confronted Jenkins, and yet something about their exchange didn't sit right. The confession was too clean, too easy. Jenkins had been too calm, too certain of his victory. It had all unfolded with an almost theatrical precision, and Poirot, his ever-present suspicion flickering like a dim light, wondered if there was more to the story than Jenkins had let on. His gaze shifted to the small leather briefcase resting beside him. It contained the final pieces of evidence, notes, photographs, the key, and a collection of documents that had originally been dismissed as irrelevant. Poirot's fingers hovered over the case, then gently lifted the lid as if drawn to the mystery within. His mind, which had been exhausted by the confrontation, now found itself reignited, filled with a single nagging thought. There had been something about the way Jenkins had described the game. He had been so confident in his manipulation, so certain that Poirot had fallen for his trap. But what if that confidence was a mask? What if the real plan had always been something far more complicated? The idea clung to Poirot's thoughts like a shadow, following him as he stared out the car window into the night. There was still more to this story. The car rounded the corner, heading toward Poirot's flat. But the detective remained lost in thought, as if his mind refused to settle, to allow him any peace. As the vehicle slowed to a stop, he absent-mindedly reached for the case, then paused. The streetlights flickered as they passed, casting fleeting shadows across the sidewalk, and something caught his eye, a small detail that seemed insignificant at first but quickly became all too apparent, a figure standing just beyond the corner of his building. A tall, slender man, his face hidden in the shadows, his posture too still, too deliberate. It was a momentary glimpse, a flash of recognition, and then the man vanished, melting into the darkness like a spectre. Poirot's heart skipped a beat. He knew that figure. He had seen him before, long ago, on a case that had never fully been resolved. A case that had, like so many others, disappeared into the abyss of forgotten mysteries. The detective stiffened as the car pulled to a halt in front of his flat, his gaze still fixed on the spot where the man had been. He couldn't explain why, but something told him that this encounter, this fleeting moment, wasn't the last he would see of that shadow. No, this was only the beginning of another mystery, another puzzle to solve, a mystery that would weave itself into the fabric of his life once more. Poirot stepped out of the car, the rain now pouring down in sheets, and made his way up the steps to his door. His thoughts spun, each one tighter than the last. Jenkins had played his game, but there was someone else behind the curtain, pulling strings that even Poirot had failed to see, and that person, whoever they were, had just made themselves known. As he opened the door to his flat and stepped inside, Poirot felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle over him. But it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that came from solving a case. It was the kind of fatigue that crept in when you knew you weren't done yet. When the puzzle wasn't finished, when the questions still outnumbered the answers. The rain continued to beat against the windows, the city outside unchanged. But Poirot knew with an unsettling certainty that his work was far from over. The world had a way of throwing mysteries at him when he least expected them, and this one, this new enigma, had already begun to unfold in the shadows, just out of reach. He sat down at his desk, the weight of the briefcase still heavy in his hands. His eyes scanned the papers, his mind already racing ahead, seeking patterns, searching for a hidden meaning. The clock ticked steadily in the background, the only sound breaking the silence. Poirot didn't look at the time. He didn't need to. The questions had already begun to form in his mind, each one more elusive than the last. And with them came the unmistakable feeling, the one that told him with quiet certainty that the game was far from finished. The detective leaned forward, pulling the papers closer. He had solved this case, yes, but in doing so, he had unlocked a door to something far more intricate, far more dangerous than he had anticipated. The truth was still out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for him to find it. And no matter how many times he thought he had reached the end, he always knew, that the next mystery was just waiting to begin. A single thought echoed in his mind as he sat there in the dim light, his fingers tracing the edge of the briefcase, the rain still tapping against the windows. The mystery never ends.